Good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. There's so much of very deep concern in the news with respect to budget cuts, and news this morning from Egypt that is disheartening. I feel very good about bringing you a good piece of news from New York State. You've been seeing in the papers that nationally the SAT scores for the first time since 1968 have leveled off. They have been dropping ever since 1968. But there's even better news on this from our state of New York, because the scores from 1980 to 1981 in fact have increased in New York, both on the verbal and on the mathematics tests. Our scores went up 3 points on the verbal test, and we're now 3 points above the national average. And our scores went up 6 points on the mathematics test, so that it puts us now 5 points above the national average for mathematics. So while we've seen a national trend of leveling in these 2 years, for New York State, we've actually got this very significant increase in both verbal and mathematics scores. Now, what makes this news even better to me is that this increase of scores is coming from a larger percentage of our students taking these examinations. One might have thought, well, there was a smaller group of students this year, 1981, as contrasted with 1980, and that might account for their increase in scores. But the fact is that a higher percentage of our 12th graders in 1981 took the SATs than the percentage of the 12th graders in 1980. And the figures there are that 58.4% of all the 12th graders in 81 took the SATs, while it was back at 57.6% in 1980. So that it means we have a larger group of students scoring substantially higher in 1981 than the group of students did in 1980. The other characteristic of these scores, which I want to share with you, and which I think is perhaps most encouraging of all, is a look at the future. Does this indicate that we may have now a trend of continuing increases in SATs? This is, after all, just 1980 to 81, and the concern is, will this continue on through until the succeeding years? And I'm very optimistic that it will, and we have some evidence here to display for you that I think suggests this. In New York State since 1966, we have been testing 3rd graders and 6th graders in reading and in mathematics. And so we have excellent statewide reporting for those students, and the students in 1980 and 1981 classes back at the time that they were in the 3rd and the 6th grades. And if you look at this chart, which has the verbal scores, what you'll see is this is the 6th grade line, this is the 3rd grade line, and up here the SAT verbals. These are the classes, or the points at which the students graduated. Now, what we had in New York for the class of 1980, which is shown here, was a steady trend down on reading until 1980, about a flat trend here on the 3rd grade when these students were taking those reading tests. And you can see that we had a steady trend down on the SAT verbal in that period of time. But then notice what happens. From 80 to 81, it was flat at the 3rd graders, and then it begins to climb steadily, as does the 6th grade graph. This stops here at 1981. I'm optimistic that as we look at the 1982 and 83 and 84 classes, as they take their SATs, that what we will see is a similar trend of increase in their scores, just in the same way we have seen it if we look back to the time when those students were in the 3rd and the 6th grade. there is a cumulative effect of learning over a period of time. And so I think this gives us good reason for optimism for the next several years. Now, the chart on this side shows the same kind of characteristics with respect to mathematics. We had a very significant trend down in the SATs up at the top here. At the bottom right here, class of 1980. Good jump for the class of 1981. These are the same students back in the 6th grade. There was the class of 1980. Now that tends to flatten out for a couple of years, and in fact to see this going up while that flattened is especially good news. But to think about this trend going this way, I think gives us encouragement that we'll probably see this continuing upward trend in mathematics. Back here in the 3rd grade math, rather than being a steady downslide, that tended to be a bit up over time, but you see it also tended to flatten out right in here. Again, here's the class of 80. 81's about the same, but then we have a significant turn up, all of which indicates to me that we're going to be looking at the lines going the right direction when we get the classes of 82, 83, and 84. Now, all of that is on the aptitude tests for verbal and mathematics. We have provided for you as well the results in the 1981 tests of achievement. And on those tests, consistently, New York State students have performed very, very substantially above the national average. There's a chart in there that indicates something about the spread. In fact, on the average, New Yorkers on those achievement tests score about 20 points higher than is scored in the rest of the country. The numbers of New York students who take achievement tests is about 32,000 a year. So you get a little sense of the contrast between the 32,000 taking achievements, while it's more than 140,000 who take the aptitude tests. During the past 3 or 4 years, with the competency testing program, which is the most rigorous standards that have been set in this country, with the pressure that we're putting on in high school registrations, with a concentration of funding on foundation skills, and much more concentration in the schools on these foundation skills, I think we have built a base and we've built an expectation for pupils, which is now being seen in the kind of results that we're displaying this morning. We expected more of the class of 1981, and they produced. And I think as we've set higher and higher expectations for 82 and 83 and 84, I'm very optimistic that we're going to see a continued upturn in their results. Thank you very kindly for the opportunity to share this good news from New York on the test scores. I'll be very pleased to respond to any questions that you have on these SAT scores or indeed on any other matters.
Does this mean that, as far as you're concerned, the educational system is just doing that much of a better job?
Yes, it does. I think the educational system is performing in a stronger fashion. I think it's performing in a stronger fashion because we're pushing hard on the standards and because teachers and administrators in the schools are pressing for higher standards and because students are realizing that they've got to meet those higher standards in order to secure the kind of employment they want, in order to gain admission to the kinds of colleges they want to attend. I think it's a setting of expectations which is higher all the way across the board.
Would the truth in testing will have any effect on this at all, the fact that students can now see the answers after they take it?
I believe not. First of all, the length of experience with the admissions testing law is a very short length. Secondly, the actual number of students who have been seeking access to their tests and the percentage of those students has been very, very low. Less than 5%, it may even be less than 3% of the students who might have sought their tests are even looking at them. We're talking about broad results here, over 141,000 students. And I don't believe it's any single act or law like that, and I don't believe that's had any kind of a significant impact on this change.
Commissioner, hasn't the truth of testing law though made students more aware of what kind of question is going to face in the English speaking exam?
No, I don't believe it has. Before the admissions testing law was put in place, either on the ACTs or on the SATs, there were bulletins that were available by the test producers. There were on the commercial market books that are like the telephone book in size, which had copies of similar tests, which had directions as to how one might take the test, which provided advice with respect to whether you should take a chance and guess or whether you should only answer with certainty. All that kind of information for potential test takers was readily available before the admissions testing program even took effect.
But the actual test had to be available, people now.
No, you could not before that time actually write in and get a copy of your exam and then go back and study that, or study the answers, and then presumably go back in with a stronger base for the next round. You couldn't do that before admissions testing. But I would repeat that the numbers of students who have actually taken advantage of that is down around 3–4%.
Well, that's the number that got an exam, of course they can show it to other people, it's certainly widely distributed.
No, I wouldn't say so. What they get back is a copy of their answer form. And I guess in some respects, when do they get the copy of the test? But the fact of getting that test back and even circulating that, first of all, probably would be a rather narrow circulation. And secondly, I think there's a very strong question as to whether actually looking at that previous test would make any significant difference with respect to somebody's score on the next test with different questions in any event. 200. 200 to 800 range. Correct. Well, I think the significance here is one of trend lines. Since '68, we've had a steady trend. This chart happens to go back just a few years, but you can see it from the chart that we provided in the backup as to what the relative decline's been over several years. And so I think, first and foremost, it's a question of a change in direction on the trend line. Now, remember that whenever a national average is calculated, New York State, of course, is included in that calculation. And New York State students are a very large portion of that total. So when we're looking at a national average and then a New York average that's 3 points above that, if you were to take a look at the New York average against the average of all other states, where New York has got probably 14 to 15% of the total number of test takers, you would see even a wider gap between what the New York scores are and what the rest of the nation's scores are. Unfortunately, I can't display that to you because they don't break the tables. College Board doesn't break the tables out that way.
Yeah, that is my mentioning is the average score of 4.4
That's right.
I mean, that gets you calculated at a very...
Well, over, if you were looking at one person or 2 or 3 persons, then a change in score of 3 points or 5 points or 10 points would not be statistically significant. You're quite right there. But when you're looking at a group of 141,000, a group which is in fact 15% of the total, a change on the magnitude of 3 or a change on the magnitude of 6 is very definitely statistically significant. In fact, if you want the mathematical figure there, a change of 1/10 of a point, 1/10 of a point, where you have a sample of 141,000, would be considered in statistical terms as statistically significant. Thank you very much for bringing that out, because I know for any individual, for one child's score, they may see it go from a range of 10 to 20 perhaps when they take it, but when we're looking over 141,000 students, it's a significant difference.
Could you categorize it?
Is this equivalent of each one of these kids getting one more question right out of like 100? Is there any way to categorize how much more, what this increase is?
No, I can't. Wynn might be able to, Wynn Lott, with respect to the numbers of correct responses. I'm not sure that you can as simply as that peg it. I've tried to at least put it in terms of statistical significance. We might come back to that if Wynn can provide you with something on that. Let's take other questions and then come back to it.
Commissioner, how much more does New York State spend than the national average on education?
Are you talking about the elementary and secondary systems right now? I'm going to have to give you an estimate here because I don't have it right on the top of my head. Maybe some of my colleagues have got it now. John, you may have it. We may need to look it up for you. I believe the average, based on the national expenditures, that New York probably at this stage would be somewhere between 25 and 30% more per pupil, roughly there. Again, I'd be very pleased we could check out. The latest data that you're going to be able to get on this will probably be back around 78, 79 because it's a matter of accumulating it for all the several states. But I think to use a figure, roughly 25 to 30% more would be on target.
Okay, taking that, for New York to be 3 points ahead of the national average, wouldn't you expect New York students to be even higher than that, above the national average?
I certainly would hope they would be, and I think we're going to see them getting back up there to where they were in the next few years.
You think the national average will also?
Oh, yes.
With the downward trend.
Yeah, I do.
And now the national average remains the same only twice, only one other time since 68 has that happened.
I suspect the national average will pick up as well. I can't, because I don't know the kinds of information nationally that we have statewide with respect to seeing what these same pupils were doing at an earlier time. I'm a little bit hesitant to make estimates on how rapidly that national average will pick up. But I think it probably is going to pick up some.
Why?
Well, because the same kinds of activities that we've had here in New York State, by way of pressing for standards, by way of pressing with competency testing, have been also applied much more rigorously in other states. And I think there's a general mood in the country that goes along with that with respect to the seriousness of study that's going to help to carry up those scores nationwide.
Commissioner, if your trend charts reflect what's going to happen on the SATs, why do we see a third grade increase going on in math scores in third grade, and yet we see a continuous decline? I mean, how can you justify saying this trend will reflect what happened in the SATs?
With respect to the math scores, I think what is most important to be concerned about is this period right in here. We had, as you quite properly have pointed out, we had a circumstance going on for several years where in fact we were seeing a pickup in third grade math, but we were seeing a decline in sixth grade math. And in the SATs, that's right. And then we begin to get the leveling here. If I were to draw this chart on out, or if we put this chart on out, you would see that what had happened here is we had a little bit of a dip and then back up again. We truncated it just because we wanted to focus on what was happening here at really the bottoming out point for the sixth grade. But I think that the key thing to note is that without any doubt, we were having a very, very great slippage between the third grade and the sixth grade. We were showing pickups at the third grade level, and we had been showing a real slip on the sixth grade for the same children. I think that what's happened and what we see here was a much stronger concentration on mathematics on into the fourth, fifth, and sixth grades, which was there for purposes of remedying a problem. You had, back in this period of time, certain confusion with respect to, quote, new math. and different kinds of patterns of instruction. And I think that in part that accounts for this discrepancy that we had. But once again, I think what's important is the leveling here and then the definite upturn on both of these lines occurs, if you will, and looking at that with respect to what happens when they get to be 12th graders.
These average scores represent the average for the total number of times the test was given over the 80 in one school year. It's given 4 times over the course of the year.
Let me just check with Wynn on that.
For the college-bound seniors, it's their latest score.
Right.
It's their last score.
So these represent the average scores taken at what point in time?
Like college-bound seniors during the course of their senior year, but it's their last score.
Right.
Oh,
So that you don't get a double and triple effect on one student. If one student took the test 3 times during the course of the senior year, that's not counting that student 3 times in these statistics. The 141,000 means 141,000 separate students. And the score that's picked up here is the last score for the student that student took. Okay?
Commissioner, your table's on the back to 72 here. When did the slip begin in New York State, and how high were we when the slip began? What were the average scores at our highest point?
Now, you're talking about the SATs, or you're talking about the PEP scores?
The SAT.
When?
We don't know. They didn't break out state reports until 1972.
72.
They did not give separate state reports out, so we really don't know how.
I wish we could provide those for you, but we're going back only so far as we can with the data that the College Board has been giving. They used to report just, you see, straight on a national basis.
Okay, put it in a bit more perspective, just nationally. How, for instance, in California,
They don't give out other state scores. We can get that eventually from California, but they don't publish all states. They just send us our own reports.
What kind of scores do colleges generally?
The demands on of the colleges on the SAT scores really are of quite a range. When the SAT program was first put in place with this scale from 200 to 800, it was put in place so that any college could, in fact, on the basis of those same tests, establish its own cutoff points. There's never been an intention by the College Board or by the SAT, by the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, to fix a point like 550 or 600 and say that's the point for college admission. The whole point of having this kind of range is that any one college can really select what is the right standard of admission for that college. And so we have a very, very broad range of cutoff points.
New York State school?
I really couldn't guess for New York State. I shouldn't guess because I just don't know what kind of a single range it would be. You can, for purposes of looking at any one of the separate colleges in Barron's guides to the colleges or anything else, see what they actually publish by way of an indication of what range they will accept. But we don't have any kind of a single figure that we have either suggested nor have the colleges gotten together to try to set a single figure which would establish that entry point. Now, you might be interested in a historical note. The business of the SAT testing goes back to the turn of the century. And the reason why the College Entrance Examination Board came into place at that time was that it's a period of time in which there was a certain broadening of access to the institutions. You're talking at that time about primarily the private institutions which were in existence in the Eastern Seaboard and some scattered in the Midwest and the other far parts of the country. And what had developed is the following. If a student wanted to apply to, let's say, Cornell and Columbia and NYU, what they would have to do back at that point is they'd have to go to the separate campuses and take an admissions test. Now, that became an extraordinarily cumbersome process. And so, in order to provide something that was simpler for the students, the College Board came into being with the idea that they would offer a single test under a board governed by representatives of the colleges and the secondary schools. But in so doing, they get a test which would have a range of scores and then permit any one of the colleges to pick that range of scores which seemed to be appropriate to that particular college. So that's how it all came into being, again, about 70, 80 years ago. And it's a system which obviously the colleges and universities still use very, very strongly. The college entrance examination scores are still the second best indicator of probable performance in college. The first best indicator is the academic record in secondary school. The second best indicator is the college board score. And it is a score or set of scores which is particularly important for the colleges where they may have students who are applying from those schools from which they don't ordinarily get applicants. Then the college has a way to help to translate what the pupil's own achievement record in secondary school is over to a comparison with other students. But that's where the way the system got in place. And of course, what we're looking at today, what I'm talking about by way of a representation of academic achievement levels, is a spin-off of the real purpose of these tests, which is namely for admission to college.
Have you been tracking the Regents exam performance on the Regents exam like this over the last few years?
Well, not in quite the same way, because you see the Regents examinations are not standardized tests in the same sense that are the PEP test or the SATs. The Regents examinations, which are developed each year with teams of faculty members and are meant to be focused very, very specifically on the syllabuses and on the content taught, are not from year to year standardized in exactly the same way that these kinds of tests. And so it is not possible to draw the same kind of trend lines with good comparisons from one year to the next. I wouldn't be commenting this year about this kind of trend line and this kind of upturn and the question of statistical significance unless we had tests here which were really very, very carefully calibrated from one year to the next as being comparable. They are, and there are such large samples involved that we can really look with certainty at these kinds of results, while on the Regents exams, we really can't do that in such precision from one year to the next.
Commissioner, do you see these increases in math and reading scores as a reflection of the getting back basics movement?
Well, I see them as a reflection of the pressure that we've put on the competency testing program and on our registration programs. Those, of course, are focused on the areas of writing, of reading comprehension, and of mathematics. And, of course, those are exactly the skills that are being tested here in the SATs. So it's this pressure on foundation skills which I think is being shown in the results that we've got here on the SAT test.
For those who are college freshmen next year, are you holding out any hope for the guaranteed student loan program?
For next year, I certainly do hold out hope for it. I have a sore throat and a cold today, and I think it's partly because I've been yelling so much last week and the week before on the whole federal budget cut business. The action right now is in the Congress. The President has proposed a very significant decline in federal funding, and including the Guaranteed Student Loan Program. I've been commenting about the impacts on New York State students that those presidential recommendations would have, so that our delegation and other members of the Congress would recognize the importance of rejecting the President's recommendations and moving forward with the recommendations from the House Appropriations Committee and assuring that we have substantial funds for next year for student loans, for Pell Grants, and for the several federal education programs.
What's your feeling from talking to the congressional delegation?
Well, I think that the kinds of amendments that are being considered for the appropriation are such that even those who would be most likely to support the President have advanced amendments which are of less danger and would cause less reduction than the President had advocated. That's a good sign. But I'm looking for where the majority of the House is going to be, and I'm hoping that the majority is going to be at least at the level of the House Appropriations Committee, and on this Guaranteed Student Aid Program in particular, above that level.
Have you submitted a request for next year's state budget?
Next year's state budget? Oh yes, we submitted that in the public meeting that we held here in July. It's been submitted to the budget director on September 10th, the formal submission.
And it was under yet, they told you what to expect?
No, sir, not yet. I have my formal budget hearing with the director of the budget in the mid part of next week. But we filed all of the backup information. If you didn't get it then and want it at this point, we'd be pleased to provide you with a copy of what we've advanced.
How many requests did you ask
I beg your pardon.
about any federal cuts?
I'm sorry, I didn't get.
Any requests that you made to the state budget, you requested picking up any federal cuts?
No, sir. We did not match any specific requests that we made to specific federal budget cuts. I would point out that the regents took their action on this in July of 1981. In fact, they did it on the 30th of July. The Reconciliation Act didn't occur until the 31st of July, and so it was done before that time. But we did not try to match our specific request with those federal budget reductions. Now, since we have another round of reductions in the works, we may have to come back on some points with respect to a request, but I know the mood of the governor and the legislature with respect to the tightness of the state dollar, and we are not trying to advance a program of pickup at the state level for federal cuts. Our work is really focused on Washington trying to hold as much as we possibly can at the federal level. That's where I'm expending our efforts. So we don't have to put additional pressure on the state budget.
How much is your request above last year's funding? The state budget? How much more money do you have?
In the aggregate, would you let me just take a look at the figure again? I'm sorry, I want to be sure you got it just exactly right on percentage terms. Mike, you may have it here. If you hold on for just a minute, we'll give it to you exactly. I got my head so full of statistics right at the moment on SATs that I'm sorry, I just don't have that. Thank you very kindly. Mike? Hello there. You want to use the pointer? Go right ahead.
Well, I'd like to see your